I first noticed it when decisions started taking longer than they should have. Not important ones. Small ones. Which message to send? When to leave? What tone to use? Every choice suddenly felt heavy. Not because it mattered. Because I was afraid of choosing the wrong version of myself. He never told me what to do. He only asked questions. What made you decide that? Did you consider the other option? Are you sure that's what you really want? At first, I found it thoughtful. Later, I realized something strange. I couldn't remember the last time I'd chosen something. Without preparing to explain it. He had a way of making hesitation sound intelligent. Whenever I decided quickly, he'd smile and say, "Interesting instinct." Whenever I hesitated, he'd nod approvingly. That's usually where clarity comes from. Slowly, a pattern formed. Speed meant carelessness. Delay meant maturity. So I began delaying everything. Not because I was unsure. Because I wanted my choices to feel worthy. I replayed options in my head long after the moment had passed. Imagined outcomes that hadn't happened. Considered risks that barely existed. One afternoon, I caught myself saying, "I'm still thinking about it," about something I'd already chosen hours ago. And suddenly I wondered. When did deciding stop feeling like confidence? And start feeling like recklessness? The first time I realized this had gone too far, it was over something absurd. Two identical choices. Literally identical. And I froze. My mind split immediately into versions. What he would choose. What he would question. What he would call impulsive. Minutes passed. My chest tightened. And then the thought appeared, not as fear, but as logic. If I choose the wrong one, it will prove I didn't think hard enough. That was the moment everything finally made sense. I wasn't afraid of making bad decisions. I was afraid of making decisions that I wouldn't be able to justify afterward. The first time I asked him to confirm a decision, I pretended it was curiosity. Not help. Just conversation. I said, "What would you do?" in the same tone people use when they already know the answer. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, thoughtful, then asked, "What are you considering?" I listed the options. He listened carefully, then said, "And which one feels safest?" Not best. Not right. Safest. The word settled somewhere deep. I chose that one. Later, I told myself I had decided on my own. After that, it became easier to ask. Not directly, I never said tell me what to choose. I described situations in detail. I explained my thinking. I waited. He almost never gave answers. Instead, he asked questions. What outcome are you trying to protect? Which one would you regret less? What are you afraid might happen? And by the time the conversation ended, I already knew which option I was supposed to pick. I called it insight. But one evening, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. I had started delaying decisions. Until I could talk to him first. Not because I needed help. Because choosing without his framework felt irresponsible. The dependence didn't feel emotional. It felt logical. When I chose something alone, I replayed it afterward, imagining what he would have questioned. Sometimes I changed my mind hours later, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't defend the choice in his language. Once, standing in front of something simple, I caught myself thinking, "I'll decide after I hear what he says." And then, quieter. I don't know how to decide without that anymore. That was the moment I finally understood what had happened. He hadn't taken my ability to choose. He had taught me a system where every decision needed permission. Not from him, but from the version of myself that thought like him. The first time I chose without him, it felt like breaking a rule I didn't remember agreeing to. Not a big rule. Just a small one. Something ordinary. Forgettable. I decided quickly, before I could hesitate, before I could imagine his questions, and I didn't tell him. For the rest of the day, I waited. Not for consequences. For correction. Every few minutes, my mind replayed the choice from different angles, searching for the flaw I must have missed. The tension followed me everywhere, quiet and constant. That night, I finally told him. Casually. He listened, nodded, and said, "That makes sense." Just that. No pause. No question. No refinement. Relief washed through me. And then something else, just as sudden. Disappointment. I hadn't realized how much I wanted him to question me. Not to disagree. To prove that the decision had been difficult enough to deserve approval. Instead, he accepted it immediately. Later, alone, I couldn't stop thinking about it. If he hadn't challenged it, did that mean it hadn't needed challenge? Or worse, had I finally chosen something correctly on my own? The thought should have comforted me. It didn't. Because my mind rewrote the moment almost instantly. Maybe I had unconsciously chosen what he would have chosen anyway. Maybe I'd predicted his framework perfectly. Maybe this wasn't independence at all, just obedience that arrived early. And suddenly, the victory felt thin. The next test was deliberate. A decision I knew he wouldn't approve of. Not dangerous, just inefficient. Emotional. Untidy. I made it without telling him. This time, the discomfort was sharper. Focused. Every part of me wanted to prepare a defense before he even knew there was something to defend. When I finally told him, I watched his face. He paused. Just a fraction longer than usual. Then said, "That's interesting. Not wrong. Not risky. Interesting." The word landed like a diagnosis. And in that moment, something in my chest tightened painfully. I wasn't afraid of disappointing him. I was afraid of discovering whether I could still trust a choice that didn't survive his evaluation. After that, his questions changed. Not what he asked. When he asked. He stopped speaking before my decisions. He waited until after. Only after I had chosen, after I had acted, after I couldn't undo it, he would tilt his head slightly and say, almost casually, "What made you go with that?" At first, I thought it was interest. But the questions were never neutral. What were you trying to avoid? Which part of that felt necessary? Did you think about the consequences? They weren't meant to help me choose. They were meant to see how I chose. I began answering carefully, shaping my explanations so they sounded intentional. Mature. Thoughtful. One evening, halfway through an answer, I stopped. Because I realized something that made my breath catch. I wasn't explaining my decision. I was defending it. The first time I understood I was being evaluated, it happened by accident. I made a choice I knew he disagreed with. I saw it in the pause, the small tightening around his eyes. But he said nothing. Later, when I started justifying myself, he interrupted gently. "I'm not judging," he said. "I'm just curious how you think now." Now. The word stayed with me, as if there had been a before. After that, the feeling followed me everywhere. Not approval. Not disapproval. Measurement. How fast I answered. How emotionally I spoke. How quickly I corrected myself. It felt like an exam I hadn't agreed to take. And worse. One I was grading myself on. The moment everything shifted came when I realized I had started designing decisions for the test. Before choosing anything, I imagined the conversation afterward. Which risks I would admit. Which motives I would hide. Which mistakes I would explain away in advance. Sometimes, I changed the decision itself, not because I wanted to, but because it would sound better when I described it later. Cleaner logic. Stronger narrative. Fewer questions. And the truth finally surfaced, quiet and terrifying. I wasn't choosing what I wanted anymore. I was choosing what I could explain convincingly to the person who had become the measure of whether my choices were allowed to exist. The realization came quietly, in the middle of a sentence. He asked, "Are you happy with how that turned out?" It was an ordinary question. But my mind didn't answer it. Instead, it produced an explanation. A perfect one. Balanced. Logical. Detached. I heard myself speaking and suddenly stopped. Because I realized something terrifying. I had no idea whether I was happy. Not because I was confused. Because I hadn't checked. For a long time now, I hadn't been measuring my life by how it felt. I had been measuring it by how well I could defend it. After that, I started noticing it everywhere. I chose things I didn't want because they sounded responsible. I avoided things I loved because they sounded impulsive. I rewrote desires into arguments before they were allowed to exist. Sometimes, late at night, I tried to remember the last decision I'd made. Only because I wanted it. Not because it was safe. Not because it was logical. Not because I could explain it later. I couldn't remember one. And the grief that came with that discovery was quiet and unbearable. Because I understood something I had never admitted before. I hadn't lost myself suddenly. I had explained myself away. One decision at a time. I don't tell this story because he controlled me. He didn't. He never told me what to choose. Never demanded obedience. Never asked for power. He only asked questions. And I admired him enough to start answering them for the rest of my life. The quiet truth I live with now is this. Control doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as intelligence. As reflection. As the belief that every choice must be justified before it deserves to exist. And once you learn to live that way, you don't need anyone to watch you. You become the one who keeps explaining your own life until there is nothing left. That feels like it was chosen freely.